You were never supposed to hear this name. The Silent Sisters of Black Hollow. Say it aloud, even in a whisper, and you will feel the weight in the air thicken. It is not a legend written in books, not a tale recited around campfires, not a whisper in Sunday sermons. It is the kind of story that families erased from their memory, that priests condemned as blasphemy, and that scholars dismissed as myth. Yet it was real, and the silence surrounding it was not because of ignorance, but because of terror. The year was 1789, and while the world obsessed over revolutions, charters, and the dawning of new freedoms, a small valley in the Appalachians drowned in shadows. There, at the edge of civilization, women disappeared, not in ones or twos, but in clusters. Daughters, wives, widows, no ransom, no witnesses, just vanishing. The villagers whispered of a cloister hidden in the trees, a sanctuary that promised healing for the broken-hearted, shelter for the abandoned, and spiritual cleansing for the fallen. They called themselves the Sisters of Mercy, but no one who entered ever returned with the same voice, if they returned at all. For years, men searched for their missing. Hunters scoured the woods, deputies raised posses, preachers declared holy crusades, but the forests swallowed them whole, and the order remained untouched. The few who stumbled back told of women dressed in black veils, faces pale as bone, eyes wide and unblinking. They spoke no words, only gestures, as though their tongues had been cut. And when they raised their hands in unison, the intruder's will collapsed, as if their mind itself had been chained. These were not women of faith, they were a hidden order of control. The villagers began to notice strange patterns. Families who resisted church tithes suddenly fell ill. Fathers who questioned the sisters' growing influence found their children wandering to the woods, never to return. And when silence fell over Black Hollow at night, it was not the peace of prayer, it was the silence of domination, a silence that suffocated every thought of rebellion. You were not meant to know this, but once you step inside this story, there is no way back. The Silent Sisters will follow you into your dreams, into your doubts, into your hunger for truth, and that hunger, if you are strong enough, will turn into fire. History will tell you the Sisters of Mercy were never real. That is the first lie. The second is far darker. Not only were they real, but they were sanctioned. In 1789, when the colonies still dripped with the blood of revolution, power was shifting, and wherever power shifts, control is tested. The Silent Sisters were not born out of devotion to God. They were engineered, an order designed in secrecy, cultivated by wealthy patrons who understood one eternal law. Men can be silenced by force, but entire generations can only be silenced through the mothers. Think carefully about this. Women are the carriers of memory, of ritual, of the soft shaping of children before they even speak. If you wish to fracture a nation, you do not start with armies. You start with the mothers. The sisters were the weapon. In Black Hollow, they established themselves as saviors of the abandoned, orphans, widows, runaways. No one questioned when these women vanished into the valley, because the world above had already abandoned them. But behind the walls of their cloister, something more sinister unfolded. Records buried in courthouse basements, records never meant for your eyes, hint at rituals of silence. New initiates were stripped of names, stripped of speech, stripped of memory. Their tongues were not literally cut out, but their language was broken down through repetition, chants, and punishment. They became vessels, empty shells through which control could flow. The sisters existed for one purpose: to bend the will of others. Witnesses spoke of their gatherings at dusk, where their silent gestures could command a man to kneel, to forget, to turn against his own family. Psychological domination disguised as holy discipline. And those who attempted escape returned broken, faces hollow, eyes void, their minds fractured beyond repair. Why was this tolerated? Why did no authority intervene? No, because the authorities themselves were not outside the order, they were inside it. Black Hollow was more than a valley, it was a testing ground. The sisters were not isolated lunatics, they were part of a network, a hidden branch of influence that sought to control not only a community, but the very idea of obedience. Every empire needs its silent enforcers, and in that century, silence was the deadliest weapon of all. You cannot understand the terror of the Silent Sisters without first understanding how they controlled the human mind. Fear is powerful, yes, but fear alone does not bind a man forever. The sisters did not just frighten their victims, they rewired them. The first documented account comes from Elias Harrow, a hunter who vanished for 3 weeks in the fall of 1792. When he returned, he was a shell. His family found him wandering the edges of the forest, barefoot, mumbling fragments of scripture that twisted into nonsense halfway through. He never spoke his own name again. When asked where he had been, he simply raised his hands in the same gestures the sisters were known for, and then fell into silence. He lived another 17 years without a single word, his mind shattered like glass. This was not madness, it was design. You see, the sisters believed silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was the destruction of self. Through rituals of enforced quiet, through long hours of staring, fasting, and rhythmic gestures, they could peel away layers of identity. Victims described the feeling of their thoughts no longer belonging to them, as though their very will had been replaced with a foreign current. Imagine it. Not being chained by rope or iron, but by the very betrayal of your own mind, your memories turned to smoke, your voice stolen, not by knife, but by suggestion. The Silent Sisters had weaponized psychology centuries before the word even existed. Villagers began to whisper of night wanderers, men and women who stumbled through the streets in silence, faces blank, eyes open but unseeing. Some bore strange marks across their arms and necks, symbols carved not in flesh but in ash and soot, rubbed in by the sisters during initiation. These wanderers were not the same people who had been taken, they were living proof that the sisters could hollow out a human being and leave the body intact, a puppet to be summoned when needed. The most chilling detail, those who encountered the wanderers reported feeling compelled to stay silent in their presence, as though the silence was contagious, spreading like an infection through the air. One farmer wrote in his journal, "It is not their faces that haunt me, it is my own voice dying in my throat when I see them." That is how control begins, not with bloodshed, but with silence so heavy it consumes even the strongest voice. It was the night the children disappeared that the villagers finally understood. The sisters were not a sanctuary, they were a harvest. The date was November 2nd, 1794. The harvest moon hung blood-red over Black Hollow, staining the valley in a light that looked more like fire than silver. Parents tucked their children into bed, whispering prayers against the strange stillness that had fallen over the forest. Dogs would not bark, cows would not stir. Even the crickets fell mute. It was as if the entire valley was holding its breath. By dawn, 32 children were gone. No broken windows, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Doors were found still bolted from the inside, blankets still neatly folded. Only the beds were empty. Entire households awoke to silence that was more crushing than death itself. Mothers clawed their throats raw from screaming. Fathers tore apart barns and fields, searching, always searching. But there was nothing. The only clue came from young Samuel Pike, barely 8 years old, who somehow survived what the others did not. He was found at the tree line, barefoot, eyes wide, lips moving soundlessly. When a preacher pressed a hand to his chest, the boy finally spoke one phrase. "They called me in my sleep." After that, he never spoke again. Witnesses swore they saw a procession in the distance that night, figures draped in black, veils flowing in the moonlight, each holding a lantern whose light was too dim to be fire. Some said they heard faint humming, though no lips moved. Others swore the sisters carried the children already silent, their small heads bowed as if drugged by some unseen power. The valley never recovered. Every family was touched. Some lost one child, others two, some lost them all. Grief gave way to rage, and rage gave way to madness. Men gathered in militias, weapons in hand, to storm the hollow. Yetics. Each time they marched into the woods, their torches sputtered out, their will dissolved, and one by one they came back empty-handed, their anger drowned in that same suffocating silence. The Silent Sisters had made their message clear. They could take what they wished, when they wished, and no authority, no father, no church, no God could stop them. That was the moment Black Hollow ceased to be a village. It became a graveyard of voices, a valley bound by silence. When the children vanished, the church could no longer ignore the whispers. The Bishop of Charleston sent 2 priests into Black Hollow, carrying with them crucifixes, holy water, and written authority to purge heresy. Their mission was simple: confront the sisters, uncover their rituals, and break their power in the name of God. They were never seen again. Weeks later, fragments of their clothing appeared at the edge of the woods. Their rosaries were found in the mud, crosses bent at unnatural angles, as though twisted by unseen hands. And then came the sermons, not from the bishop, not from the priests who had vanished, but from the villagers themselves. Men who had once worked the fields now spoke with uncanny calm, reciting verses in unison, their cadence cold, mechanical, rehearsed. Entire congregations began to chant the same hymns, word for word, in the exact same tone, as if one voice had spread across 100 mouths. The bishop sent more investigators, but each time the same result: silence. Not silence in the sense of absence, but silence in the sense of obedience. The men returned hollow, the fire of faith drained, their eyes blank. They bowed before the sisters without resistance. Somewhere deep within the cloister, a decision had been made. The church would not destroy the order. The church would use it. Hidden correspondence discovered decades later in a monastery archive reveals a chilling truth. The bishop's letters did not lament the loss of his priests. They celebrated the purity of the experiment. In his own hand he wrote, "The women obey without question, the men follow without blood. This is not heresy. This is power. Do you see it?" The very institution sworn to protect the faithful became the order's greatest patron. The Silent Sisters were no longer an isolated cult. They were a weapon sanctified by religion. And what weapon did they wield? Not fire, not steel, not even scripture. They wielded silence, a silence that suffocated will, erased doubt, and hollowed men from within. Understand this: what began in Black Hollow was never about faith. It was about control. And once the church saw the power of silence, they would not destroy it. They would replicate it. To understand the Silent Sisters, you must first understand the machinery that created them. These women were not all monsters at the beginning. They were daughters, widows, orphans, souls fractured by grief or betrayal, drawn into the hollow by promises of refuge. But once inside the cloister, they ceased to be women. They were broken down piece by piece, until nothing remained but silence. The initiation began with 3 nights of fasting: no food, no water, no light. The novices were left alone in stone cells, their hands bound, their voices forbidden. Guards, or perhaps watchers, paced the halls, whispering fragments of scripture backwards, their voices rising and falling until the mind could no longer separate prayer from madness. On the 4th night, the women were brought to the chapel. There they were forced to kneel in a circle around a single candle. They were not allowed to look at it. They were told only to stare into the darkness beyond its glow, for hours, for days, until the darkness itself began to move, until the flicker of the candle became the heartbeat of their existence, until their own thoughts no longer belonged to them. Those who resisted were punished, not with whips or fire, but with silence turned into weapon. Imagine being locked in a chamber where not a single sound exists. No footsteps, no voices, not even the sound of your own breath. A silence so deep it feels like pressure crushing your skull. Hours turned into days. By the time the doors opened, most begged to submit, just to hear again. When at last they were judged worthy, their names were stripped away. Their tongues were bound by a vow, their identities dissolved. From that moment forward, they spoke only in gestures. No more laughter, no more cries, no more individuality. They became mirrors of one another, faceless, voiceless, obedient. And yet there was something more sinister. Our survivors, rare as they were, whispered of a final ritual. A sister stood before the order, her mouth forced open, while another pressed a blackened finger against her tongue. Not a knife, Not a brand. Just ash. The ash of what no one ever discovered. But from that moment on, her voice was gone. Some swore it was only psychological. Others believed something far older was at work. Something not born of man. The Silent Sisters were not merely trained, they were remade. Every system of control is tested by rebellion. The Silent Sisters were no exception. It is said that in the winter of 1796, one of the initiates, her name lost, but remembered as the red-haired girl, attempted escape. She had entered the cloister after her family perished in a house fire. For weeks she submitted to silence, to fasting, to the breaking of her will, but something inside her resisted. Some spark of memory refused to die. On the 7th night of her initiation, she slipped from her cell and fled into the snow. Villagers claimed they saw her staggering through the fields, her lips moving, her voice hoarse from disuse. She was trying to call for help, though no sound came. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that she had already been marked. The sisters followed, not by torchlight, not by dogs, but by silence itself. Witnesses swore the snow carried no sound of footsteps that night, though dozens of veiled figures moved through it. They caught her at the tree line. Some say they carried her back, others say they buried her beneath the ice, but the truth is darker. Days later, the villagers heard a sound they had not heard in years, singing. A woman's voice, broken, fragile, but undeniably human. Drawn by hope, families rushed to the chapel, and there she was, the red-haired girl standing before the altar, her lips moving, her voice returned. For a moment it seemed victory, proof that silence could be broken, but as the villagers leaned in to listen, they realized the horror. She was not singing her own words, she was singing theirs. Every word they had spoken since entering the chapel, repeated back to them in her broken voice like a mocking echo. She was no longer a woman, she was a vessel. From then on she stood at the gates of the cloister as a warning, not bound, not chained, but silent once more, her eyes blank, her mouth open, as if ready to speak, yet no words ever came. Children called her the Hollow Bride. Parents told their sons and daughters never to meet her gaze, for fear their voices would be stolen too. The rebellion had failed, and worse, it had proven the sisters' power could not just erase a voice, it could weaponize it. It would be comforting to believe the sisters remained confined to their valley, their terror sealed behind the trees of Black Hollow. But silence is not a prison. It is a contagion. And contagions spread. By the dawn of the 1800s, strange shifts began appearing in neighboring towns. Families who had never set foot near the hollow reported children waking in the night, walking into the fields without reason. Merchants found themselves forgetting entire conversations, only to discover their buyers repeating their words back to them hours later. Preachers began to notice that their congregations fell unnaturally quiet during sermons, as if some invisible hand had pressed down upon the entire room. At first, these were dismissed as coincidence, as superstition, as the unease of a growing nation. But then came the markets. Witnesses described women in black veils, standing silently at the edges of public squares. They never sold, never bought, never spoke. They only watched. And the more they watched, the quieter the crowd became. Quarrels ended abruptly. Bargains were abandoned mid-sentence. Laughter died on lips as though smothered. People walked away, unsettled, unable to explain why. When questioned, the townsfolk could not recall the women's faces, only the veils. Only the silence. This is how infiltration works, not by invasion, but by influence, not by breaking doors, but by bending wills. The sisters had discovered something more valuable than obedience within their walls, the ability to export silence like a weapon, to seed it into minds far beyond their cloister. Records from court proceedings in 1803 tell of entire juries sitting mute, refusing to deliberate, their eyes glazed, their mouths clamped shut as though welded. The judge himself collapsed mid-trial, clutching his throat. No medical explanation was given. The verdict was never delivered. And in every report, every testimony, one detail returned: the sight of women veiled in black, standing in the crowd, watching. Black Hollow was no longer a hidden cult. It had become a silent empire. The most dangerous thing about power is not its violence, it is its patience. Empires of silence do not conquer, they wait. They wait until men willingly kneel. The government could ignore missing children, it could ignore wandering madmen, broken priests, and haunted markets, but it could not ignore silence in its own courts. When juries stopped speaking, when verdicts dissolved into blank stares, when judges themselves fell mute, the state was forced to act. In 1804, officials gathered in Charleston to draft a response. Their solution was swift. Send marshals into Black Hollow, burn the cloister, scatter the women, a formal order of eradication. On paper, it was decisive, but reality tells another story. The marshals rode out with rifles and torches. They did not return. At least, not as men of law. 2 weeks later, they appeared again, not marching in defiance, not carrying weapons, but kneeling at the steps of the Charleston courthouse. Their uniforms were filthy, their eyes glassy, their mouths closed. One by one, they removed their hats and placed them neatly on the steps. And then, silence. Hours passed. Days. They did not move. They did not eat. They did not drink. They knelt until their bodies collapsed. Witnesses said it was not suicide, it was ritual, a silent demonstration of loyalty to something unseen. And though officials tried to conceal the event, word spread like plague. If armed lawmen could be hollowed, what protection was left for ordinary citizens? Behind closed doors, politicians argued. Some demanded war, others demanded secrecy, but a third faction, quiet, calculating, saw opportunity. They asked the forbidden question: if the sisters could command silence so absolute, why destroy them? Why not control them? Or better, why not learn from them? The eradication order was quietly withdrawn. Official records were altered. The marshal's disappearance was rewritten as lost in a storm, and the sisters were never mentioned in public government proceedings again. Do you understand the weight of this? The state had faced a terror that could hollow men alive, and instead of erasing it, they bent to it. They chose silence. That was the moment the Silent Sisters crossed a threshold no cult had ever crossed before. They became untouchable, not because they were invisible, but because they had been seen, and those in power chose to let them remain. It is one thing to fear silence, it is another to sanctify it. But it is something far more terrifying to make silence an institution. The Silent Sisters were no longer confined to Black Hollow. They had been noticed, not merely as a cult, but as a mechanism. And what is a mechanism if not something to be replicated? From 1805 onward, silence began to appear in the machinery of governance itself. Not literal veils, not cloisters in the woods, but structures that mirrored the sisters' methods with uncanny precision. Courtrooms where witnesses fell mute under questioning, schools where children were drilled to repeat lessons until their own thoughts blurred into obedience, barracks where soldiers were taught not to ask, not to think, only to obey in perfect stillness. Do you see the pattern? This was not religion. This was engineering. The principle was simple. Strip away individuality and the will collapses. Fill the void with ritual and obedience flourishes. The sisters had refined it in their cloister, but now the state carried it into every institution, not through veils and gestures, but through systems. And here lies the genius of silence. It does not look like tyranny. A dictator shouts, and men resist. A tyrant raises the whip, and rebellion brews. But silence feels natural, it feels polite, it feels like order, and so men lower their voices, they swallow their questions, they kneel without realizing they have knelt. By 1810, entire towns recorded sudden waves of quiet conformity. Taverns went dry, not because of law but because no one dared to speak loudly. Assemblies met in hushed tones, decisions passed without debate. It was as if the air itself demanded submission. And always, always there were the women in black, never intervening, never speaking, only watching. Their presence was enough. A reminder that the hollow was not confined to geography, it was a philosophy. Silence had become systemic. But here is the truth most men cannot face. Silence is more than absence. It is a weapon, a blade without a handle, and those who wield it carve not flesh but identity. This is why you were never meant to know this story, because once you see how silence works, you begin to notice it everywhere, in courts, in schools, in families, in the very fabric of the nation, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. Silence is not peace. Silence is control. Every system of control eventually produces its traitor, the one who sees too much, who dares to speak. For the Silent Sisters, that man was Jonathan Reddick, a clerk in the Charleston courts. Reddick was no revolutionary. He was meticulous, a keeper of records, a man who believed in order. But in 1811, he stumbled across what he was never meant to see. Transcripts of trials that ended not with verdicts, but with silence. Depositions where witnesses answered in gestures, as if language itself had been erased. And scattered through the margins of these records in different handwriting were strange symbols, loops and crosses resembling the markings seen on the hollow wanderers. He began to dig. He cross-referenced disappearances with trials, trial delays with market sightings, missing jurors with visits from veiled women. The pattern was undeniable. Wherever the sisters went, silence followed. Reddick wrote everything down. In a hidden ledger bound in red leather, he recorded dates, names, symbols, and testimonies too disturbing for public record. He titled it The Hollow Doctrine, and then he made the greatest mistake of his life. He tried to publish it. The night before the manuscript was due to leave on a courier, neighbors reported strange sounds from Reddick's home. Not screams, not violence, but singing. A low, hollow hum, rising and falling like waves. By morning the house was empty. The courier arrived to find every page of the Hollow Doctrine burned in the fireplace. Except for one. A single sheet, spared by accident. On it were only 7 words, written in Reddick's careful hand. Silence is the mother of obedience. No one ever saw Reddick again. His name was stricken from the court rolls. His family vanished from records within a year. It was as if he had never existed, but whispers remained. Some claimed to have seen him wandering the edges of black, hollow, lips moving without sound, eyes vacant. Others swore the sisters displayed him in their chapel, a warning of what happened when one dared to break silence. The state called it disappearance. The church called it divine punishment. But those who knew the truth called it what it was, erasure. The kind of erasure so complete, it makes you wonder how many other names, how many other truths were swallowed whole by silence. And here is the part they fear most. Sometimes late at night when you close your eyes, you can still hear the hum. Every cult leaves behind traces of its creed. For the Silent Sisters, it was not the Bible they clutched, but something older, darker, and infinitely more unsettling. It was called the Book of Ash. No official copy exists today. No library catalogues it. No museum dares admit to holding fragments. But scattered references appear in letters, in hidden inventories, in the journals of men who stumbled too close. Always described the same way, a thin black volume, its pages grey as soot, its ink smeared as though burned into the parchment. It had no author's name, no date, no origin, only silence. Those who read it claimed it did not teach, it unmade. There were no sermons, no commandments. Instead, the pages were filled with repetitions, phrases that looped endlessly until the mind began to blur. Words inverted, scripture rewritten backwards. Chants meant not to inspire but to hollow. The longer you read, the less you remembered of yourself. Some swore entire days vanished, stolen by the ink. And yet, within those looping fragments lay a doctrine. Not spoken openly but carved between the words. Speech is rebellion, memory is weakness, silence is the womb of power. This was the true creed of the sisters. Not charity, not mercy, not salvation, but the belief that silence itself was divine. That to erase the self was to become a vessel for something greater, something older than church or state. A monk who handled a recovered fragment in 1821 described the pages as warm to the touch, as though still smoldering. He burned the piece in fear. Weeks later, he was found wandering the cloister ruins in Black Hollow, his mouth packed with ash. He never spoke again. And so the question lingers. What was the Book of Ash? A forgery? A psychological weapon? Or something more? Something carried across centuries, guarded by hidden orders, rewritten through fire and silence until it became a ritual in itself. Here is the truth. Institutions do not preserve myths unless they serve power. If fragments of the Book of Ash survived in secret archives, they were not destroyed for protection, they were kept for study. Because what better weapon could exist than one that erases resistance not by sword, not by fire, but by silence? The sisters were not the authors of this doctrine. They were its inheritors, and its spread did not end in Black Hollow. Every oppressive order leaves behind rebels, men and women who refuse to bow. But in Black Hollow, resistance carried a cost not measured in lashes or chains. Entire families vanished. Not one or two members, entire bloodlines erased, as though silence itself had swallowed them. The first records come from 1792. A family known as the Whitcombs refused to send their daughters into the care of the sisters. They were farmers, plain and stubborn, and swore no cloaked women would take their kin. Weeks later, neighbors arrived to find the Whitcomb farmhouse standing open. Food sat untouched on the table, a loaf of bread half sliced, a fire still smoldering in the hearth. But not a single person remained. Husband, wife, children. Even the livestock were gone. Their neighbors whispered of strange symbols carved into the wooden beams, circles within circles, a mark like a blackened sun, and on the table a single grey feather, though no bird in the region bore such a colour. This was not an isolated occurrence. By 1805, at least 6 more families had vanished in the same manner, houses left in eerie perfection, as if life had been interrupted mid-breath. In every case, the only evidence left behind was a trace of ash. Ash in the bedsheets, ash in the wells, ash pressed into the cracks of the doorframes. Officials wrote them off as wilderness tragedies, attacks by wolves or families fleeing debts. But the locals knew better. They whispered that the sisters moved at night, faceless under their veils, not killing but absorbing. To resist them was not to die, it was to be erased. Even darker were the journals of Reverend Aldous Gray, who secretly investigated the vanishings. He recorded that the sisters used a phrase, spoken once, never repeated, before entering a home. The mouth of silence must feed. Those words, he claimed, were not a threat, but an invocation, and the family term, eyes who vanished. Their names were never spoken again within Black Hollow, not out of fear of gossip or punishment, but because something happened when you tried. Your tongue froze, your lips faltered. It was as though the very memory of those people had been drained, leaving only faint outlines in the minds of those who loved them. Tell me then, was this superstition, or the earliest evidence of a system more precise than any army? A system that conquers not by blade, but by erasing memory, identity, and speech itself. By the dawn of the 19th century, the disappearances in Black Hollow had grown too numerous to ignore. Whispers of the sisters spread beyond the valleys, carried by merchants and vagrants until they reached the ears of state officials. What followed was the first recorded attempt to bring the silent sisters under control. In 1811, a delegation was sent, 30 armed men, led by magistrates from the capital. They were tasked not only with investigation, but with dismantling the so-called order. The official documents still exist, tucked in brittle archives, and they are chilling in their brevity. The men set out. They reached the hollow. They never returned. 2 months later, a single horse staggered into the nearby town of Colchester, its saddle torn, its eyes wild, the magistrate's crest still hanging from its bridle, but no rider. What came next is buried in a confidential report, unearthed years later. When a search party braved the hollow, they found the weapons of the 30 men stacked neatly at the base of a ruined church. Not broken, not bloodied, just arranged, blade against blade, like offerings, and above them, smeared in ash upon the stone, 3 words: "We speak not." No bodies were found, no graves, Only silence. The state, embarrassed, buried the failure. Publicly, they blamed hostile terrain and illness. Privately, officials debated whether the sisters were a cult, an insurgent faction, or something beyond classification. But one truth became clear: conventional force could not penetrate Black Hollow. Why? Because the sisters did not fight like men. They did not rally with muskets or blades. They used something far more precise: silence as contagion. The men sent to subdue them became part of their order, not by choice, not by faith, but by erasure. And here is where the records grow most disturbing. A clerk reviewing testimonies wrote that some of the men's widows stopped speaking after the expedition. They would sit by windows for hours, eyes glazed, lips trembling but never opening. One woman, questioned under oath, finally whispered, "He told me nothing, and in nothing, I followed." Do you see it now? Power is not always in domination. Sometimes it lies in absorption, in taking the voice of those who rise against you, until even their memory serves the silence. The sisters had faced their first confrontation with authority, and they had won, without lifting a single weapon. Every society claims to despise the cults it cannot control, but history tells a darker story. When institutions see power they cannot crush, they learn to feed from it instead. So it was with the Silent Sisters. After the failed expedition, the government of the state did not send another. They did not burn the hollow, nor scatter its order. Instead, they turned inward, and certain men began to whisper, perhaps the sisters could serve. There are letters, half-burned, hidden in family vaults, between landowners, judges, and merchants of influence. They speak not of eradicating the sisters, but of engagement, of arrangements to keep certain populations docile, of the utility of silence in matters of unrest. One merchant writes chillingly, "They possess a gift of stilling tongues. Imagine what advantage this brings against rumor, against dissent." This was the true turning point. The sisters were no longer just a local terror. They became an unspoken instrument. Records suggest that by 1820, select elites had begun to funnel resources into Black Hollow: food, coin, even protection from external scrutiny. In return, the sisters offered something no militia, no army, no law could provide: psychological dominion. They could erase resistance without spectacle. They could dissolve families who whispered treason. They could silence witnesses before their words reached court. The arrangement was never signed on paper. It did not need to be. It was sealed in secrecy, in exchanged favors, in shadows between power and silence. And it was so effective that other institutions, religious orders, courts, even prisons, began to mirror the sisters' methods: the punishment of speech, the exaltation of obedience, the threat of erasure. Do you understand what this means? The Silent Sisters were not outsiders clawing at the gates of civilization. They were woven into the very fabric. Jesse's say of it. Their doctrine of silence became a tool, not just for themselves, but for those who rule. And isn't that the way with hidden orders? They survive not because they are strong alone, but because the powerful see in them a reflection of their own hunger. When you hear of rebellions that mysteriously dissolved, of witnesses who lost their voices, of movements that evaporated without bloodshed, ask yourself, was it accident, or was the hand of silence guiding the erasure? The sisters did not need to conquer the world invited them in. Power does not last on fear alone. Fear trembles, then fades. What the sisters built was not fear, it was ritual. A precision of silence so complete it rewrote the will of those who stood before them. Accounts of these rituals are rare, but fragments survive. A traveler named Dorian Vex wrote of hearing chantless gatherings in the woods of Black Hollow. He said it was the most disturbing sound he had ever known. Not screaming, not music, not words. Just dozens of women breathing in unison, perfectly synchronized, so steady it seemed the air itself obeyed them. The first stage was disorientation. A subject brought before the sisters would stand in the center of their circle, stripped of sound. No speech was permitted, not from the sisters, not from the captive, not even from the earth. They would smother fire so it gave no crackle. They packed earth until no twig broke underfoot, only breathing, only silence. Then came the binding, not with ropes, not with chains, but with gaze. Witnesses claim that a dozen veiled faces fixed upon you at once was more suffocating than any iron shackle. It made the strongest man feel like a child drowning. The final stage was hollowing. Here is where the sisters revealed their true weapon. Silence used not as absence, but as pressure. They surrounded the captive and exhaled in unison, long and slow, until his own breath faltered. He would try to speak. No words would come. He would try to scream. His throat would close. And in that moment, something happened. A collapse. Not of body, but of self. Those who emerged from such rituals did not leave broken. They left empty. Farmers, soldiers, even magistrates walked away days later with no rebellion in them, no fire in their eyes. They returned to their families, docile, compliant, incapable of questioning. Their voices were flat, their memories vague. Some did not even recall the ritual itself, only that speaking felt dangerous and silence felt safe. Tell me, what is more terrifying than death? It is obedience carved into the soul. The sisters had mastered not violence but transformation, and in this transformation they discovered something the ruling classes coveted, a way to manufacture submission without blood. It was not magic, it was not myth, it was psychological warfare at its most precise, and it worked. Black Hollow was only the beginning. A ritual perfected in secrecy cannot remain hidden when the powerful see its utility. And so, silence as a weapon began to spread, not as folklore, but as practice. By the 1830s, reports surface of institutions across the region adopting disciplinary silence. Schools where children were punished not with canes, but with enforced hours of wordless stillness. Churches where congregants were made to kneel in mute prayer, their confessions withheld, their tongues stilled. Prisons where the most defiant inmates were sealed in isolation cells, not for days but for months, emerging blank, eyes hollow, voices gone. Do you see the pattern? Silence was no longer the doctrine of a secret order. It was becoming policy. The mechanism was simple but devastating. Remove sound, remove speech, remove the individual's ability to express pain, rebellion, thought. And soon, the mind breaks itself. What the sisters tested in their woods became the architecture of control in society. One particularly chilling example, Eastern penitentiaries of the 19th century adopted what they called the silent system. Prisoners were forbidden from speaking, even to one another. Meals were eaten in silence, labor was done in silence, and any man who broke the rule was lashed or locked in darkness. Officials praised the system, claiming it produced discipline, but what it produced was obedience, identical to the results of Black Hollow's rituals. Coincidence or transmission? Ask yourself, how does a method once hidden in the woods find its way into state institutions within decades? Unless certain men carried it there. Men who saw in the sisters not evil, but efficiency. And once silence became discipline, it became culture. Children learned to fear the sound of their own voices. Parishioners learned to keep their doubts locked inside. Convicts learned that speech was rebellion, and rebellion was suicide. The creed of the sisters, speech is rebellion, silence is power, had become woven into the fabric of everyday life. Understand this. Control does not always march under banners or armies. Sometimes it whispers in classrooms, sometimes it kneels in pews, sometimes it echoes in the quiet of a prison corridor. The world beyond Black Hollow had begun to mirror the hollow itself. The infection was spreading not through blood but through silence. Until this point, everything we know of the sisters comes second-hand, whispers, vanishings, fragments. But in 1847, history records something extraordinary. A man escaped. His name was Elias Rowan, a miller by trade, taken after refusing to pay tribute to the sisters. Unlike others who vanished into the hollow, Elias returned, ragged, starved, but alive. He staggered into a nearby town at dawn, his lips cracked, his eyes unfocused. The villagers carried him to the parish house, and for 3 days he could not speak. His mouth opened, but only breath came. No words. Then, suddenly, he spoke, and what poured out horrified those who listened. He described being led deep into the forest, into chambers carved beneath ruined stone. There the sisters surrounded him. They placed him in their circle, and for hours, days, he could not tell, he endured the ritual of hollowing. He felt his memories blur, his will collapse, his very name dissolving. But Elias resisted. He claimed he clung to one thing, a single word. His daughter's name. He repeated it silently in his mind, again and again, anchoring himself against the tide of silence. "As long as I remembered her," he said, "they could not take me." He escaped one night when a storm tore through the hollow, scattering the sisters. He crawled through mud, guided only by the sound of thunder, real sound, not silence. But here is the part officials buried. Elias revealed the sisters' scripture. He swore their doctrine was no invention of desperate women, but part of something older. "The Book of Ash," he whispered, "is not theirs. It was given. To whom? By whom?" He died before he could say. Because 3 days after breaking his silence, Elias Rowan was found dead in his bed. No wounds, no struggle, only a face frozen in horror, lips blackened with ash. And just like that, the only survivor was erased. His testimony scattered, his name nearly forgotten. But remember this detail. He survived by clinging to a word, to a name, to identity. That is the first crack in the sisters' dominion. Because if silence is their weapon, then memory is the shield. And that is why his story was buried. Power always seeks permanence. Armies fade, movements collapse, but blood endures. The Silent Sisters understood this, and so did the men who shielded them. By the mid-1800s, their doctrine of silence had seeped not only into institutions, but into families. At first it was whispered of in scandal, wealthy judges whose daughters vanished into cloisters, merchants whose wives were said to take the veil, though no convent claimed them. But these were not vanishings, they were recruitments. The sisters were no longer drawing from peasants and widows, they were being fed by elites. Letters hidden in aristocratic estates show a pattern. Families with political enemies, with rivals in trade, with inconvenient scandals. Those enemies disappeared, and always, shortly after, a daughter was quietly sent to serve the order. It was tribute, yes, but also transaction, a blood pact sealed by silence. And once inside the hollow, these daughters did not return, but their families prospered, their debts dissolved, their rivals fell mute, their sons rose to prominence. Coincidence or payment? The effect was generational. Children grew in houses where silence was a virtue, not a punishment, where secrets were currency and speech was treated like sin. Entire lineages learned to guard their tongues, to smother their doubts, to inherit silence like others inherit land. One chilling record survives from 1863, the diary of Lucinda Bray, child of a prominent banking family. At age 12, she was taken to Black Hollow. Her last surviving entry reads, "They tell me I must not speak, but silence is heavy, it crushes the bones. Still, father says this is honor, mother says this is power. I am afraid that soon, even my thoughts will not be my own." That was her final page. She never wrote again. Understand this, silence was no longer just an order's weapon. It became dynastic, it became inheritance. The same way land and money secure power, silence became a lineage, a tradition passed down, binding families to the hollow like chains of ash. And it continues, even now. Look at the great houses of power. Notice the daughters who vanish from records, the wives who dissolve into shadows, the children raised never to speak of certain matters. You think these are coincidences? Or do you now see the thread? That silence itself became the secret language of blood. This was not just an order. It was a breeding ground, a covenant of silence passed from mother to daughter, father to son, until silence itself became the inheritance of the elite. Silence was their weapon, yes, But silence leaves traces, and those traces can still be seen if you know where to look. The Sisters of Black Hollow did not simply vanish into mist. They marked the earth with a language older than speech. Travelers who dared cross the hollow reported ruins where no town had ever been built. Stones blackened by fire, walls half buried in moss, archways leading nowhere. But carved into them, always the same symbols. Circles within circles, spirals broken by a single line. A sun with its rays inverted, pointing inward instead of out. These were not decorations. They were invocations. Each mark a command, to contain, to absorb, to silence. Scholars who studied rubbings of the stones claimed the geometry carried a pattern, mathematics of control. Ratios so precise they seemed designed not for beauty but for the human mind. When gazed upon long enough, the symbols created unease. Prolonged exposure left headaches, even muteness. And then there were the structures themselves. Hidden chambers beneath ruined churches, where doorways narrowed into impossible angles. Passages designed to bend sound, to swallow echo. Imagine standing in a corridor where even your footsteps betrayed no noise, where your very heartbeat seemed stolen by the stone. These were not accidents. The sisters built or inherited architectures that served their creed, places where silence was not absence but presence, where the walls themselves conspired to erase the voice. In 1878, an explorer named Hal Whitman smuggled a fragment of stone from the hollow to Boston. Within days, he fell violently ill. His tongue swelled. He wrote feverishly in his journal that the stone consumed sound. When he dropped it into a basin of water, the splash made no noise, only ripples. Weeks later, Whitman was found dead, his lungs full of ash. So ask yourself, what force did the sisters serve? For silence to leave such marks, for stone itself to bend sound, it could not have been mere ritual. It was worship. Worship of something older than man, older than the church, older than Black Hollow itself. The symbols carved in stone were not warnings. They were doors, and once opened, they did not close. Every order claims devotion to something greater. But what of the sisters? If silence was their creed, what force demanded it? The answer was never spoken outright. Even their allies, judges, merchants, priests, avoided the question. They supported the sisters but never named the god they served. Yet fragments survive. A priest, Father Corbin, recorded a confession from a dying sister in 1852. She whispered through cracked lips, "We are not the mouth. We are only the veil." When asked what lay behind the veil, she began to choke. Ash spilled from her mouth. She died before she could finish. Another clue comes from Elias Rowan, the lone survivor we spoke of before. Remember his words. The Book of Ash was given, but given by whom? His testimony ended there, cut short by death. And then there are the symbols, the inverted sun, the spirals collapsing inward. They are not marks of creation, they are diagrams of consumption. They do not radiate outward, they pull inward, as if they describe not a deity of life, but a force of absorption, a presence that feeds not on worship, not on blood, but on silence itself. The ancients called such entities hollow gods, forces not of fire or storm, but of void, not what fills the world, but what drains it. They cannot be praised with hymns. They cannot be summoned with sacrifice. They can only be invoked by absence, and that absence is silence. Is this why the sisters demanded vows of muteness, why their rituals crushed identity until only emptiness remained? Because they were feeding something that thrives in vacancy, something that grows when voices are extinguished, when names are erased, when memory collapses into ash. One chilling phrase recurs in letters seized from Black Hollow. The mouth of silence must feed, not metaphor, not poetry. A statement of devotion, a recognition of hunger. Even their allies feared to say its name, perhaps because it had none, perhaps because in naming it, you give it shape, and in giving it shape, you invite it closer. What force did the sisters serve? Not a god, not a demon, but something worse, the endless appetite of silence itself, and silence does not rest. You would expect a force this consuming to rise endlessly, swallowing all in its path. But history is stranger. Around 1889, the Silent Sisters vanished. Not slowly, suddenly. The records stop. The disappearances cease. Merchants who once spoke of dealings with them fall silent. By the early 1890s, even the hollow itself is abandoned. Houses rot, chapels crumble. The woods reclaim the land. The sisters are gone. No war, no uprising, no fire, just absence. But ask yourself, how does a doctrine that infiltrated families, institutions, even nations, simply dissolve? Did their allies turn on them? Did the hollow consume them as it had their victims? Or was their silence too complete, too successful, erasing even themselves? Some say they left willingly, that the Book of Ash instructed them to vanish when their task was finished, that silence, once rooted deep enough in society, no longer needed its keepers. Others whisper something darker, that they were devoured by what they served, that the void they fed finally opened wide, swallowing its own priests. And here lies the true horror. Their disappearance was not a relief, it was a wound. For decades afterward, towns near Black Hollow reported strange phenomena. Whole nights where no birds sang, no dogs barked, no wind stirred. Nights when sound itself was absent, as if the sisters still breathed through the trees. Farmers claimed their children woke screaming, unable to speak until dawn. Men swore they saw veiled figures at the edges of their fields, silent, watching, waiting. And then there were the buildings. Travelers who explored the hollow's ruins found them eerily preserved, as though time itself avoided them. In chambers beneath the earth, they found piles of veils, folded neatly, no bodies, no bones, just the clothing of women who had once been, as if they had shed their forms like snakeskin and stepped into something else. So what is more frightening, a cult that thrives, or one that disappears, leaving no answer, no conclusion, only a silence that lingers like a curse? Because the sisters may be gone in name, but their silence is not. It seeped into courts, schools, prisons, homes. It became law, tradition, culture. They no longer needed to exist for their creed to reign. Sometimes the most dangerous orders are not destroyed. They are absorbed, and silence, once planted, never dies. You think their absence means safety? No, it only means their presence changed shape. Silence is a weapon most effective when invisible. The sisters did not need monuments, uniforms, or banners. They needed obedience without words, fear without evidence, erasure without blood. That kind of weapon does not vanish, it migrates. Look at the decades that followed. Courtrooms where victims of abuse were told to remain quiet for the family's sake. Schools where children's tongues were beaten into silence. Hospitals where patients' cries were dismissed as delusion. Everywhere the same doctrine. Hush the voice, protect the order. Is it coincidence, or the sisters' legacy wearing new masks? Consider this. In the early 1900s, records emerge of societies of quietude in major American cities. Men and women gathered in secret lodges, pledging never to speak of certain matters, domestic disputes, workplace injustices, disappearances. They even wrote oaths eerily similar to the Book of Ash, though softened, professionalized, stripped of religious imagery. By the 1920s, silence had become institutional. Corporate offices had policies forbidding whistleblowing, police departments developed codes of silence, priests invoked sacred confidentiality to hide atrocities. Governments created classified files buried deeper than graves. Do you see it now? The Silent Sisters did not die. They multiplied. Their veils turned into paperwork, into codes, into laws. Their chapel was replaced by the office, the courtroom, the hospital ward. And their silence is stronger than ever, because now it wears legitimacy. If a woman's cry for help is ignored, it is not called cruelty, it is called procedure. If corruption is buried, it is not called violence, it is called policy. This is how their cult survived extinction, by merging with the very bones of society. We no longer call it the sisterhoods. We call it professionalism, secrecy, protocol, but the root is the same. The hollow may be abandoned, but its silence is everywhere. And what is most chilling, unlike other cults, the sisters require no recruitment now. The world itself trains its children into their doctrine: speak less, obey more, do not question, do not reveal. The silent sisters no longer need to walk among us. We carry them in our institutions. We repeat their creed every time truth is buried under the weight of silence. And in that sense, they never disappeared at all. What does silence cost a man? Not just his voice, but his very identity. Generations who grew under the doctrine of silence learned to mistrust themselves. A child who cries and is ignored does not simply stop crying. He stops believing his pain is real. A woman who speaks truth and is shamed into silence does not simply hold her tongue. She learns that truth itself is dangerous. Over time, silence corrodes reality. It reshapes perception. And when enough individuals live like this, entire societies begin to fracture. You see it everywhere. Families bound by secrets they never dare name. Communities whispering about horrors yet insisting nothing happened. Nations built on unspeakable crimes, maintaining stability by refusing to admit the blood beneath their foundations. That is the true curse of the Silent Sisters, not their rituals, not their veils, not even their chapel of ash. It is the legacy they implanted in the human psyche, the belief that silence protects, when in truth it enslaves. Men grow hollow. Their anger festers inside, unspoken, until it consumes them. Women carry burdens that age their spirits decades before their time. Children learn to look away, to bury their own instincts, until they cannot tell the difference between obedience and complicity. This is how empires remain standing long after they should have crumbled, not through strength but through silence. Silence hides the cracks. Silence paints over the rot. Silence tells you it is better not to know. And you, sitting here listening, you already feel its pull. Haven't you noticed? Even now, a part of you is afraid to share this video, afraid to comment, afraid to voice agreement. The sisters are not in Black Hollow anymore. They are in your hesitation, in your pause before speaking, in your decision to say nothing when you should speak everything. That is the depth of their power. A cult, too, had no longer needs to exist physically, because it planted itself into the human condition, and every generation inherits that seed. Unless someone chooses to break it. But beware, breaking silence is not easy. It demands confrontation with everything buried. It demands facing truths that institutions, families, even your own mind have trained you to avoid. It requires war not with others, but with your own fear. And that is why most men remain silent until they die. If silence is the prison, then breaking it is the rebellion. But rebellion has a cost. When a man finally chooses to speak what was forbidden, the world turns against him. Friends drift away. Institutions erase his name. Families call him a traitor. He feels the full weight of the sisters pressing down, though their hands are invisible. And yet, something extraordinary happens. The moment truth is spoken aloud, even in a whisper, a chain breaks. Fear cracks like old glass. For the first time, a man realizes the prison was never locked. The silence only seemed unbreakable because he believed it was. One word shatters the veil. This is why the sisters feared speech more than swords. A single sentence can undo decades of control. A single man refusing silence can ripple through history. But understand, once you break silence, you can never return. The world will look different. Conversations will sound false. Institutions will appear hollow. You will see how often silence is used as a shield for corruption, abuse, and hidden power. You will no longer belong to their order. You will stand outside of it, awakened. And awakening is dangerous, because the world despises those who will not remain quiet. This is the final secret of the Silent Sisters. They never truly controlled others. They trained others to control themselves. They created men who silenced their own instincts, women who buried their own truths, generations who policed their own tongues. The perfect system, because it required no enforcement, only compliance. You are at a crossroads now. You have heard what you were never meant to hear. You have glimpsed the hollow, seen the sisters' shadows stretching into your own life. So I ask you directly, will you remain silent, carrying on their legacy without question, or will you break it? Type these words in the comments. I break the silence. Do it twice. No. But for me, for you. To burn the creed of the sisters and to mark yourself as one who refuses their chains. Most will scroll away. Most will choose comfort. But a few, those who speak, those who dare, will awaken into a life where silence no longer dictates fate. The silent sisters of Black Hollow are not gone. They live in hesitation, in secrecy, in fear. But the moment you speak, the moment you break their code, you kill them. The choice is yours.